Good morning, everybody, and like to extend my own personal very warm welcome to all of you from around the world. It's really great to be able to kick off this Asia Global Dialogue. As the Vice Chancellor has just said, we really miss having all of you in Hong Kong in person, and we hope that we'll be able to do this AGD next year in person in Hong Kong. But I think this is actually a very opportune time now as the world moves towards some form of recovery. And we'll be discussing what our views are, how fast that recovery, where it's going to end up, etc. What are the impact that has been really left behind by the pandemic, etc. What we really need to do is to actually use the session today to just take stock of where we are, and then maybe think a little bit, dream a little bit about what the future can be. I think the unique perspective that I think AGI can bring, and the gathering of people that we have on this program today, I think will give us perhaps a unique Asian perspective on this issue. I'm sure many people from around the world will be looking at the same issue. What about the future? What about the need for a new multilateralism? What's the shape of that new multilateralism going to be? And as the geopolitics evolve, what is the impact of geopolitics? And I am really very much looking forward to hearing myself some of the views from Asia on these very important future next step issues for the world. With us today, we have a really distinguished panel. Sam Palmisano, Chairman of the Center for Global Enterprise. Welcome, Sam. Marie Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank. Marie is well known to us in many multilateral institutions, including the WTO, etc. And then, of course, my old friend Mark Tucker, who is very au fait with all the issues of Asia, having been years and years based in Hong Kong as a group chairman of HSBC, and now, of course, traveling the whole world. So let's get straight into it. The first topic I like to perhaps cover with the panel is the global recovery from the pandemic, and really take a quick look at just a quick health check, if you would, on the state of globalization. Now, so, Mark, maybe I can turn to you first. What is the state of the global economy, and how far do you think we are into this process of recovery? And if you can just look a little bit at the end of the tunnel, how bright is that light at the end of that tunnel?
Victor, thank you, and again, great pleasure to see you and be here today. I think if you look at the state of the global economy today, I think certainly our view would be that the global economic activity has rebounded better than feared earlier last year. That somewhat hit more recently by seeing global growth begin to slow, and the slowing down really coming due to renewed weakness in developed markets, with three significant headwinds: the pandemic itself, inflation, and supply constraints. I mean, just to be clear, first of all, and I think we've discussed before, that the pandemic is not over yet. The struggle against COVID hasn't been won, even though enormous progress has been made. And we've seen different attitudes across the world. China clearly continuing to pursue a zero COVID approach. So you've seen lockdowns and restrictions come into play, and potentially impacting growth due in part to ongoing uncertainty. Across the rest of Asia, particularly the ASEAN markets, we've seen spikes in COVID-19 cases, and tightened restrictions have shuttered factories and limited local spending. And particularly those economies most affected are those reliant on tourism, Thailand and the Philippines clearly being two, as vaccination rates are still lower than in much of the developed world. And we've seen the anomaly of India, because activity has rebounded pretty strongly, and certainly relatively strongly, since the outbreak of cases, significant outbreaks in the spring. So again, the differential of the pandemic on one hand. The second headwind is inflation. US inflation figures are still the main focus of financial markets. And for much of the year, US inflation has surprised on the upside. While monthly price increases have slowed over recent months, what we're seeing is a broader range of products and services now being infected. Inflation may roll over in the second half of 2022, but this will depend, and I'm sure Sam and Marie will talk about it, on the supply chain bottlenecks easing. And there's little evidence that we can see that's easing at this point. And we certainly feel US headline inflation will remain high for the next couple of quarters at least. The concern being here that this will result in effectively tighter monetary policy, increased interest rates, slowdown in borrowing and economic growth, and ultimately threatening current business models and expectation. The rest of the world is also seeing high inflation rates as economies reopen. We're seeing supply-demand imbalances being revealed as a result of global energy and food price hikes. And again, this is likely to keep headline inflation high for the foreseeable future. In Asia, we see local inflation less of a concern, and this really being because the region's growth revival has been much more export-led than consumer-led compared to the rest of the world. And this is due to relatively less consumer demand by Asian standards. But inflation is starting to tick up, even if from a lower level. The belief is that key policymakers' focus will remain on growth. Victor, the final headwind is around supply constraints. And in those economies that have opened up, demand does appear to be strong, but it's now running against limited supply. And the challenge is getting enough product onto shelves as well as having sufficient workers. And the pandemic has impacted manufacturing capacity, generated some pretty mixed and volatile demand patterns, and extended logistical interruptions impacting the movement of raw material and finished goods. And pandemic-linked disruptions are expected to ease, but the container situation hopefully improving. But we don't believe that we will see supply chains normalize for at least another 12 to 18 months as companies cope with significant backlogs. Overall, I mean, households still have sizable amounts of pandemic savings. Wage growth is still pretty strong for low-income workers, particularly in leisure and hospitality. But inflation could weigh on this, and clearly the link between activity and inflation has deteriorated, and we're seeing for the first time in decades a potential taste of stagflation. So I think all of this leaves central banks facing a challenging job, and eyes on the Fed. But central banks in much of the world outside of Asia have also started to tighten, and we expect that to continue to do so. In Asia, central banks have stayed on hold so far, and as long as inflation's concerns aren't as prevalent yet, and growth has been weaker, will likely stay. So I think it's in the developed world, we've seen differences. Norway and New Zealand have already raised rates. Others, including the Fed, the ECB, and the Reserve Bank of Australia, have chosen to leave rates on hold for now. The Bank of England is sort of somewhere in the middle, looking to tighten soon, but not as soon as markets had first thought. So I think to end, Victor, I mean, it's a situation we all have to monitor closely, and it's as it will determine how bright that light is at the end of tunnel, how much of the tunnel actually remains.
Yeah. Well, that is an excellent summary, Mark. I mean, you've really given us a real snapshot. I think at first your reminder that the pandemic is not over yet, is not over, and especially on some less developed parts of the world. We get into that in a moment. And the other is, although demand is coming back strongly in the developed economies, we're really now facing, for the first time in many years, a real case of inflation. And this is absolutely exacerbated by major disruptions in the global supply chains, which were, frankly, we at Li and Fung are dealing with every day. I can tell you it is a major disruption. You know, the availability of containers, everybody knows about, and then the price of energy and the price of raw material is shooting up. So in my mind, there is no possibility that there won't be increase in prices and there will be inflation. Then the real critical issue, as you pointed out, Mark, is how and when will the central banks act on interest rates? And I think that's a real crystal ball. But I think, just moving on, Marie, I'd like to just now turn to you. There's a lot of talk, as we just to continue the conversation the Mark and I just had of a, sort of two-speed recovery process in the world. While we're talking a lot about the demand and what's happening in the economies, in the developed economies, what about the developing economies? As a result of this pandemic and what has happened, are they being left further and further behind?
Yes, thanks, Victor, and thanks, Mark, for that excellent summary about the headwinds. I think indeed our data is showing that while the world economy is experiencing a rebound, most of it is really being driven by the advanced economies and to some extent some of the emerging markets, mainly in East Asia like China. But really what we have seen is a two-speed recovery where emerging markets and developing economies are lagging advanced economies in their recovery. And they are experiencing much slower growth, and some still not experiencing any recovery. And the output in advanced economies are expected to regain its pre-pandemic trend by the end of 2022, but output in emerging markets and developing economies in 2022 is still expected to remain below pre-pandemic projections. And in fact, maybe 2/3 of developing economies will not reach a pre-pandemic level until 2023, and for some of the hardest hit, not until 2024. And if you try to understand, the drivers behind the uneven recovery, it's really unequal vaccine rollout and the ability to continue with the fiscal stimulus, the capacity to be able to continue with the fiscal stimulus, and obviously much lower capacity to undertake fiscal stimulus compared to developed countries. And if you look at the vaccine rollout, the pace and distribution of vaccination remains very uneven, with only about 3% of people in low-income countries having received at least one dose, compared to 50% of the global population having at least one dose. So the continued spread and flare-ups of COVID-19 will continue to pose a significant downside risk to the growth outlook, especially for developing countries. And I think, as we know, in Asia, some have experienced second and third waves, and had longer lockdowns than before. And I think the other problems that emerging markets will face is really that they are more vulnerable due to increased debt. Even before the pandemic, they already had high levels of debt. So as they have had to undertake huge fiscal responses, they've also increased their debt. And the tightening of financial conditions, the potential rise of interest rate is really going to also put them in serious situation. And some of them will be facing continued stress on that. And I think the other issue is trade. Obviously, just like there is an uneven recovery on the growth, there is also uneven recovery on the trade recovery. With really, if you look at the figures, East Asia has experienced a strong recovery on trade. Even 6 months after the pandemic, actually global trade was already back up to pre-pandemic levels, but the uneven recovery is also on the trade front, where countries which are better integrated with the world economy and being part of the global value chain, recovering faster, and being able to, most of them coming back to pre-pandemic level. But the rest of the world, the rest of developing economies like in Latin America and Africa and even South Asia are not recovering so well. And again, it is related to the lockdown, the vaccines, but most importantly, your integration to the world economy, market economy, as well as to global value chains enables you to recover faster. So it's kind of a message that economic integration and in a way globalization still matters. Although I think we can discuss further about what type of globalization will we need moving forward. So I think there are still a lot of challenges. Inflation was mentioned, higher commodity prices, and there is a dampening effect on recovery prospects and trade recovery prospects with what all of you have mentioned, which is the supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions due to various reasons. Victor, you and I were in a session on this, and basically, I think Mark, you also said it's going to still be another 12 and 18 months before these supply chain disruptions are going to be settled. And it has a lot to do with COVID in one way, disruptions at the ports, a lack of workers. If you remember the Marx person in our panel, he said it's not the shipping part, it's the land transportation, the intermodal transportation that's an issue.
Yes.
And the fact that you have to move quickly when one place locks down, you have to move quickly to another source. And it's not that easy to move a big ship, basically. So I think we still have a lot of challenges, and developing economies will be, I think, still on a slower path. And within developing economies, also different paths of recovery. And I'll just close with this point that this is the high risk of increased inequality is very real.
I think that's very, very powerful, Marie. As I listen to you, I just really get a stronger and stronger sinking feeling that we really got to address this inequality sooner rather than later. Two things. It does seem that it's quite obvious that the developing economies will take a longer time to recover, and there will be a bifurcation of the haves and have-nots. And is this increase over time? How can we address it? And I would be a lot stronger than you in saying I think the integration, the global integration, bring together by necessity. Because I think if you combine this with the pandemic and the mutation of the virus, etc., I don't think the developed world can feel safe if the whole world, including developing world, is not completely solved, so to speak. I remember, I think somebody at the WHO said, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So I don't think you can just say, hey, look, let's just go off on our own, insulate the world, and then we'll let these guys come, later, but it's not going to work that way. So it's going to be totally interconnected, and we've got to solve the problem holistically. And integration, I think, is a must. Now, one of the biggest issues, and I'm going to turn to you, Sam, the big elephant in the room, of course, is the most important bilateral relationship in the world between China and the US. And this, as we all know, has been evolving. There's been some, I think, more optimistic signs in my mind in recent weeks and months. Can you give us an assessment of that relationship today in your mind, and how that could impact all the issues that Mark and Marie and I have talked about just now? How is it going to affect this future integration of the world, let's say?
Well, Victor, thank you so much for having me. And also, I'm honored to be part of the Asian Global Institute Advisory Board. I enjoy being with all my colleagues in Asia. As you know, I lived in Japan for several years. It's always great for me to be back. And I can't wait to travel again. In fact, we have a family trip scheduled for Japan in February, as long as we don't have to quarantine for 10 days. And so we'll be back over there. But we're waiting to see. Right now, you'd have to quarantine, as you know well. And some of our colleagues have had to stay in those hotels, didn't find it a great experience. But having said all that, I think I'd like to start, Victor, with a comment from some economists. And so many people that are going to be in this call, they are economists. And there's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Kahneman, who was a behavioral economist. And he's taught us that the human brain is controlled by many unconscious reflexes and biases, sometimes known as heuristics. And there are three factors: loss aversion, anchoring effect, and narrative bias. The first one, loss aversion. We dislike losing more than we like winning. The brains of humans and other animals contain a mechanism that is designed to give priority to bad news. And as they say in the news, if it bleeds, it leads. The other one's the anchoring effect, sometimes also called availability bias, where we're heavily influenced by recent ideas or frames or experiences, as the one we're in right now. And that many times what's going on in the consciousness is irrelevant to the decisions that need to be made as we proceed into the future. I think it's very relevant. The last one's called narrative bias, where we see compelling narratives where none exist, and we let them blind us from objectivity in facts and statistics. I think we all agree that if you look at what we see in the media cycles around the world, they're great obstacles to progress, and it's the bull market of doomsayers. I mean, I guess it's easy to say that fundamentally that countries view each other as adversaries, which is probably appropriate. And I'll get very quickly, I'll move to the two largest countries in the world. But I think from a business perspective, we should not be viewing things as adversaries. I mean, we shouldn't let emotion get in the way. We should make decisions based on facts and analysis and the data that's available, and come up with constructive solutions. In a way, we should encourage competitiveness. I mean, I think competitiveness is really, really important. I mean, if you go back in time, Victor, and everybody else, and Mark and Marie, I mean, let's think about, it wasn't that long ago. In fact, in the early days when I was living in Asia and going over to Japan, remember it was US and Japan, and there was a thing called Japan Inc. When I was a young executive for IBM, we sent an invasion force into Tokyo, and we created businesses literally in Japan to out-Japanese the Japanese, right, in that local market. And we prevailed, needless to say. And then you go a little bit farther ahead, and it became the EU. I mean, the EU integrated to be more competitive versus the US and Japan. So this is not a new effect here, but I will argue that competitiveness drives innovation, drives economic growth. Society and business is better for competitiveness, right? But you have to balance competitiveness with adversarial relationships. And that's, I think, is the challenge that we face today, is this balancing between large economies competing for their interest, which is appropriate, while they try to maintain not getting into an adversarial relationship. And I think we're at a delicate balance when you have the two largest economies today kind of dealing with that. I mean, look, there is, the facts are the facts. I know the Americans, I am an American, don't like this fact, but the Chinese economy overtook the United States in 2013 in PPP. We know all that, right? And Asia's not just about supply anymore, it's also about demand. So it's driving demand as well as providing the world's supply today. And, I think back, Victor, when I was living in Asia and things like that, a lot of the younger people that were being educated viewed this idea of prosperity and economic growth as a way to kind of change their societies, change their value systems as a positive thing. But today, I don't think that's the case anymore from the Asian perspective. I think they look at the United States and they look at Europe and they see all these issues, and they're real issues that they see every night on television. And they say, I don't know that I want to be part of that system that used to offer such promise to all of us, whether that was education, economic opportunity. We talked about everybody living someplace else, which we've all done. You know, a lot of that today, these young people are looking at this and say, is this really attractive to me? So these ideas of, I'll say, regionalization or populism are becoming stronger for that reason. So therefore, you have this decoupling occurring, which we see. And the problem thing about the coupling is that it's not healthy. I mean, think about the world that we just hit. I mean, nobody could, Chris, we could argue that analytically we should have made a demand call on what would happen coming out of the pandemic. Nobody got it right. You know, no one, no economy got it right. No business got it right. That's why we have all these dislocations in supply chains. It's huge in materials. It's huge in semiconductors. It's, as you mentioned in your comments, it's cargo, it's shipping, it's everything. Because everybody got it wrong. Because nobody looked at this interconnected world. And now that the world is bifurcating and separating, it just exacerbates these problems. Because the solution is actually multilateralism, and to bring it back together again. But that's not necessarily popular when it comes to political thought. And it really is unhealthy when you think about decoupling. I mean, from a business leader's perspective, trade barriers, tariffs, they just create uncertainty. It's hard to plan what you're going to go do. I mean, I probably have more questions to your point, Vic, than I have answers, you know, right?
Mhm.
But, you know, what are the trade-offs that need to be made for economic growth and supply chain integration between these two countries, rather? Can they really operate separately? No, they can't. They're two totally, supply and demand are two totally interconnected for them to operate separately. We know that. I mean, business leaders know that. I don't know necessarily all the political leadership understands that, or their key teams, but we all understand that there's no way for these two countries to operate without some level of cooperation and interconnection. I mentioned semiconductors. I mean, look, the research is led in the United States, you know, true, and in the companies like Intel, IBM, the universities, etc. But the manufacturing capacity is all in Asia. I mean, I think 80% of the semiconductor manufacturing capacity is between Singapore and Thailand. I mean, not Taiwan, right? I mean, that's the world semiconductor. And we can talk about how we got there, but that's where it is. So this is total interconnection. You can't build this stuff without the research, and you can't ship it without the manufacturing. So the world is really totally connected. Then you talk about things that are going on, whether it's take the U.S. view of Facebook, Google, Amazon, you know, Apple, right? Or talk about Asian view of Alibaba, Tencent, Geely, ByteDance, Lenovo, right? And I bring these are incredibly global success stories, but there is a excitement from political leadership in both countries to overregulate these entities. The issue with that, and time will tell, and there's studies going on at Stanford, that will kill innovation. And if you kill innovation, you're going to kill economic growth. Is that really what we want? We want to slow down economic growth because we have issues associated with these companies. I mean, yes, things need to change. Of course, data privacy is very, very important. I'm not defending the behavior. I'm just saying the solution isn't destroy them and break them up, you know, right? Because they've been successful. The solution is come up with approaches and regulation and policy that gets them to become mature companies and integrate into the global economy with a I call a value system that people will welcome. You can go on and on again. Cybersecurity. I mean, how do you have global cybersecurity where all this data is moving around the world, and you have different standards on privacy and trust? You can't. You have to harmonize these things. You can't have one standard. I'll call it the Western standard, you know, that, and then the Eastern standard for privacy and trust. If you're going to deal with these cybersecurity issues that are all totally interconnected, and the bad guys, I'm not talking about the sovereign nations here, but the bad guys in this system are taking advantage of those seams. And we create the seams that allows them to kind of, in a way, as Mark, to break into the banks. You know, you might as well give them the code to the vault, is the way we've structured ourselves. So my point is that I know I've answered a lot of questions, but I offered up a lot of questions. I haven't answered any questions, but I do think that there's a way to think about this world that's quite different. And I'm going to start with a private sector view. And I believe that if the private sector can take the lead on some of these initiatives and begin to solve some of these problems, it will go quicker than if we rely on public policy to do that, because the policy leaders are struggling with coming together on anything, like even as simple as get together and solve a pandemic issue or climate change, things that shouldn't be debated politically, but they are in today's environment. So I think about things like, where can we come together? Big energy companies, everybody hates big energy companies, but they have lots of long-term plans that will reduce the dependency on a hydrocarbon as well as reduce emissions. But you need global standards to emerge within the energy system, because the energy system is totally interconnected. I mean, as we found out, Victor, I mean, when demand goes up, what are they doing? They're going back to the worst pollutant of all, coal. I mean, because the alternative sources, right? The alternative sources don't solve the demand problem. And it's not just in
all
China.
The small generators are coming back out.
Exactly. And you got it in the UK. You have it in Germany. They cut off all their nuclear capacity, which is a clean source of electrification, which gets me to the next point that I was going to make, which really is back to electrification. It's another area where fundamentally you could, if you look at the physics, and nobody wants to deal with the physics of these things, in the short term, the alternative sources of energy don't solve the needs of the worldwide demand, right? So you need an alternative. Nobody wants it to be a dirty fuel source like coal, and then a little bit better than that is natural gas, as we know, right? But nuclear is an alternative. Why don't we have more nuclear capacity? It's all policy, right? We've regulated it out, right? The short-term solution that exists, we don't allow to happen from a policy perspective. So what happens? People go back and burn coal. Because that is their source of energy. A little bit on supply chains, as you know, and then I'll wrap it up here. As part of my little think tank, the Center for Global Enterprise, we have a large institute around supply chains, and a lot of our colleagues on the phone are part of that thing, as Victor knows. But we surveyed the group again as far as coming out of the pandemic, what needs to be done, and they have three areas of focus coming out of the pandemic. Resilience is most important to them. And they have the challenges, which are already short-term challenges as far as which you've already addressed, I won't repeat. But you also have the longer-term challenge of location and resiliency. And you have the world that they have to make a call. Companies have to make a strategic decision. Are you going to bet on a Western supply chain and an Eastern supply chain, fundamentally hubbed in, let's say, Europe and the United States versus led by China and Asia? Is that going to be your view of the world, or will there be intercooperation and sharing that'll go on? Technology is the other area they're all focused on. COVID, if you ask them how many have accelerated technology plans based upon COVID, it's 55. Well, it's roughly 60% of those companies have totally accelerated their plans. A lot of it, they're measuring, monitoring disruptions and how to be adjusted disruptions, heavily technology in the demand calls and those sorts of things. A lot going on within the technology side of the supply chain. Their other issue that they're wrestling with is talent. There's two sides of the talent pool. One side of the talent pool is the fact that there are a lot of people have not returned to work, which is the short-term side of the talent pool, which we all know. And there's a lot of reasons for that, at least in North America, because there's so much stimulus. You wonder why was September and October great months for hiring in the United States? Because the unemployment payment stopped being paid in September. Now everybody's going back to work. It's not rocket science. There's like $2 trillion in bank accounts, as Mark referenced, that people are just sitting on, and they're going to go spend it. That causes a supply chain problem, but that's why they went back to work. But the other problem with the supply chain talent pool, guys, is that the skill set, because these things are all going to be digitally driven, right? And then if you look at the skill set that's required in these supply chain areas, there's a huge gap between what's needed for the future and what exists today. So I guess the key is, there's a lot of real challenges. There's a lot of places the world can come together on. I talked about nuclear, but just think about it. In this area of global trade, a standardized digital payment system, something that's that simple. Everybody would have to agree in the payment system. That's the financial services institutions, the manufacturers, all that has to be agreed to. But it would take a lot of inefficiency out of the system and would stimulate demand, especially in the developing world. It's that straightforward, as you know, Victor, because you lead all the work in that area.
Yes. Yeah.
It just requires a level of collaboration. It's not a technical challenge. It's just collaboration within all these various entities within these global payment systems that come together and create no different than they do for currency trading and those sorts of things. Establish platforms and standardization, and you can solve some of those things. I talked about energy. I think another good example about the private sector, everybody talks about cloud computing today, and the great benefits, because it's lowered the cost of computing. It's allowed people to have scale and large data that can solve a lot of these complex problems, whether that's in healthcare or climate or the economy, et cetera, et cetera. That all started in the private sector. It was all created in the private sector, right? And then now it's become global. Everybody's using cloud computing all over the world, but it started in the private sector. So this is why I have some hope, quite honestly, in conclusion, where you can take, I think, some of these initiatives, some of these huge societal problems that we have, organize a business-to-business relationship that solves the problem, that solves the transition in the energy system. That's a 25-year problem. It's not a 25-quarter problem, guys. It really is a 25. When you look at the physics of the energy system of the world, we're talking about a quarter of a century best case, okay, right? So fundamentally, if you could get, I think, that level of collaboration, something like the payment system to take inefficiency out of trade. So within healthcare, just data sharing of healthcare, there is no reason that we could not build models where the origin of the virus began and how it would mutate. Victor, 20 years ago, I've been retired 10, so 15 years ago at IBM, we modeled mutations of the avian flu and all the other flus. We have these scientific models, but it requires that the world input the data into the models so you can track migration paths and hopefully get ahead of it. So you just don't have vaccines everywhere. You start vaccinating where it's going to go and try to slow it down. As an example of that. So, I mean, I'll pass it back to you guys. Thank you for having me. I guess that as a business guy, we're always optimistic. This is what we do. We make our livelihood being optimistic. But I do believe that if we rely on public policy to solve these problems, we're only going to frustrate ourselves. So why don't we come together as individuals and try to get this done?
Yeah. Well, Sam, I think that was just a tour de force. Yeah, thank you very much. I tell you, what you've done in asking a series of questions, I agree, you haven't provided answers, but you asked a huge amount of questions, I think really help us to frame the issue. And the key issue that you're really framing is, we talk about the future and all the problems, and we talk about solutions. What role does the private sector really play in providing solutions for the future? Now, people focus a little bit more on philanthropy and so on. Yes, that's all part of it. The ESG, etc. That's absolutely important. But what you're really saying is micro level, bottoms up cooperation to fix the fundamentals in what we do in our business and contributing, let's say, a efficient digital system for the world's smaller SMEs to operate. And those basics may, in fact, be a very, very important path for the future that the private sector can play. But before we jump all the way to the solutions, which we'll do, I just like to ask one thing, because I'll be remiss not to bring this up. You talked at the beginning about bifurcation and how we really got to stay in an integrated world. It's interconnected, whether you like it or not. And what we really need is for the major players not to pursue a zero-sum game, and that will really bifurcate the world. And one of the things that people point to all the time is, can we find common areas, let's say between the US and China, where they can actually cooperate? Now, there's so many questions asked, and I like to throw it to the panel. Mark, I know you've got 200 people attending Glasgow and COP26, and then Maria, you were just there at the battlefront. I mean, what are the chances that climate change could be that sort of entry point for the major economies, especially US and China, to actually cooperate together? and to start this process of, really slowing down and maybe reversing this decoupling and going more to a, yes, we will compete, but it'll be a non-zero sum world. So maybe I'll throw it over to you first, Marie, because you had just come from Glasgow. Now, thank you for joining us from Nigeria, where you are now.
Yeah, I agree that we have to find ways for US and China to cooperate rather than have this unproductive decoupling, if you like to use that word. Before I address climate change, I do think on the trade front, going back and strengthening and having an open and rules-based multilateral trading system is still key. And that involves addressing the elephant in the room, which is dispute settlement system, which in the past, if you look at US-China disputes in the past, they have actually used the dispute settlement mechanism to settle their disputes. Both sides have lost and won, right? And I think we, the rest of the world who get affected by the trade wars, would prefer a world where the China-US disputes are settled in a multilateral setting, and with clear, there is a predictability out of that. And I also think the issues that the US has vis-a-vis China, and it's not just the US, but it's a more general issue on kind of this level playing field, industrial subsidies, and so on. Again, that's an area where moving forward, if WTO is going to be relevant in the 21st century to address these issues, these are also the issues that need to be on the table. So actually, we as WTO, World Bank, IMF, and UNCTAD, we are just completing a study on, OECD also, a study on subsidies in general overall. And we hope that, this can lead to a sensible way forward on these negotiations. The complex one is actually technology, in my view. That's the one that will be very difficult to settle between these two. And that, again, in the past, going to 4G and other standards and talking about cybersecurity, they are supposed to be settled multilaterally, right? You have the ITU and so on and so forth. But we don't see, actually, that's the one that I'm more concerned about, because we don't see the way forward on those. And then finally on climate, I think on climate, can we see a way where there can be a sharing of technology moving forward on how to answer climate, right? And there are actually signs of it. If you look at, let's just take a few examples that I saw from the private sector that I found interesting, apart from these big goals of net zero. Maybe 2 or 3 examples. One was, how they talk about these hard to abate sectors, which is steel, cement, aviation, and shipping. And right. And these actually contribute 30% of CO2 emission. And what I heard was that there's all these, I think they call it Mission Possible. I think that's what they're called. There's all these coalitions building up between big companies, and they include US and Chinese companies in steel, in cement, in trying to come up with solutions, technological solutions and weight and production solutions and so on and so forth to reduce the emission. And that to me was something practical and something that could be done moving forward. And then second is the finance part. This is the part that I think if you look at, it wasn't mentioned anywhere. I was sort of reflecting on this. Mark Carney came up with this. There are 130 trillion out there that will find out that will where companies and private sector banks, HSBC is one of the big leaders in this. We will go to net zero, but we need the investments to go. We need to find the right transformative investments that we can go into, right? And I didn't hear anything mentioned about the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And so I heard some people mention it. This is a huge undertaking where you are trying to have, a zero carbon, also low carbon infrastructure projects being built out. So I just wondered whether that's because basically you have commitments, but they're looking for good projects to be, good sustainable projects. Final thing I would say is that the big challenge out there is going to be coming out of apart from the net zero and the NDCs of countries, is the fact that competitiveness is going to be defined whether you are part of a sustainable supply chain or not, right? And this will involve China, it will involve the US, and there has to be some discussion and agreement as to what standards are you going to use, how are you going to agree on carbon content and the standards, and how are you going to track it, and so on and so forth. And this will require engagement and especially in the two major players. I mean, Victor, you have many ideas on that. And if we don't do that, we are going to have more disruptions, I think, in the global supply chains, and it can lead to disruption in trade that will probably affect developing countries and SMEs most if we don't deal it in a multilateral way. Yeah.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you very much for that. Mark, let me turn to you.
I think Marie has laid it out exceptionally well. I mean, just a few added points. I mean, the pandemic has shown us that national approaches to local circumstances are important when responding to a crisis, but that also there's an important place, as Marie said, for concerted cooperation, international cooperation and action, especially to help those who need additional support. And one of the positive changes the pandemic could bring, I don't think has brought to the level that it's needed to date, is a renewed focus on the importance of public health. I mean, there should be a greater sense of collective global responsibility to ensure that developing nations do have access to basic services, to clean water, vital medicines, vaccines, etc. And this should and could form one element of a new kind of globalization. But I think, as we've seen, there is mutual suspicion between countries, and this suggests that there are limits to the degree of healthcare cooperation that is possible. But I think we've seen, and Marie has said, globalization over the last 30 years has really extended an earlier focus on trade to capital flows to technology and increasing acceptance of free markets, reflecting the support for the rules-based system. Enormous progress made in the 80s and 90s when emerging markets began to make sizable gains, and more recently, and it's largely as a consequence of disappointing developed world growth, the rising inequality that both Marie and Sam have spoken about, and growing international tensions. We've seen protectionism growing, and we've seen some aspects of globalization weaken. But let's go and take back some of the numbers. If you look at the position, global trade and capital flows have continued. Global FDI flows were already higher than pre-pandemic levels in the first half of this year. With inward investment to China accounting for a fifth of these, 20% of these. And WTO now expects trade volumes to go 11% this year, revised up from 8%. And so even during the heights of the pandemic, global trade didn't stop. We saw India exports grow by almost a third in the 5 years to the end of 2020, and are up 9% this year. Year to date, Vietnamese exports are up 20%. We've seen in investment flows, non-resident portfolio equity inflows to emerging markets had more or less brought back and made back the outflows by the end of 2020. Since then, the Hong Kong stock market has enjoyed record turnover for the past 2 quarters, more than twice pre-pandemic levels. And thanks in part to cross-border equity listing. And Chinese onshore bonds has also surged. It's up to almost 4 trillion yuan, up from 1 trillion in 2017. And in American mutual funds have also invested a record amount in overseas equities. So there is elements of, I think Marie spoke about the sort of financial globalization. But the climate globalization, I think, again, there are new forms emerging. And it's arguably, as we've all said, is the biggest threat, climate change to humans and planet Earth, the biggest threat we've ever faced. And global partnerships are absolutely essential. You cannot do, it cannot be done any other way. No government or business or other institution can make significant progress on climate alone. There has to be collaboration inside industries, across industries, between public and private sector, between governments. Competitors have to talk and agree on common deliverables across industries, and trying to avoid unfair competition or creating barriers. Banks and all of us as bankers have a part to play in agreeing consistent way of sort of operationalizing targets. And governments need to understand what they can do to deliver the right market signals. So all of that is going on. As I say, I think there is an element here of climate action being a new type of globalization. Just to end with, just a couple of points on COP and to follow on from Marie. I think we've seen standout messages. The first, the will is there. And there's now, I think, real urgency to turn projects into action, and partnership between public and private sector is excellent. And we've moved from a position of less than 50% of countries covered in climate promises at the beginning of the year to close to 90% at the end of COP26. So I think, again, material movement, particularly with India coming through. Mm-hmm. But the second is the need not only for developed countries to do more for themselves, but also to provide more support to emerging markets. And it's absolutely vital that the momentum generated by COP's not lost. This has to be the next phase here. The element here is countries have promised a lot in the long run, but what are they actually going to do in the short run? And again, what are the economic and energy supply disruptions, and how severe may they be, and how much of the market's pricing them in? Much to think about, but I think there is an element of, again, on public health, on climate, both through financial globalization and a new kind of climate globalization that give us hope for the future with the backdrop of all of these trade, as you know well.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Without me as a moderator, sort of going into what I was thinking about the third section and final section of our panel here, is to really, okay, all these big problems, what are the solutions? What needs to be done? We have absolutely now segued already into that part of the whole program. And I think I'm very inspired by what I'm hearing. As far as I'm concerned, I'm really now hearing that, especially on the very important question of climate change, the commitments are now coming, they're there, okay? But the real issue is, okay, now you have the commitment, everybody's carbon net zero by X date. How do we actually get it done? The implementation phase. How do you actually find investments, as you guys were mentioning, Marie and Mark, to actually get you to, a position that you can actually have a portfolio that's carbon net zero, etc. And what I'm really hearing loud and clear is that the private sector has a role to play. And Sam, is and that role is a very natural role. It's the role not, participating really in global dialogue and policy. Even things like PPP are very important, but really among ourselves, doing what we need to do for the business. And in the long run, actually creating a world in which is actually a connected, globalized world that would actually allow us to actually do the business more efficiently despite the politics, but also allow an inclusion of allowing SMEs to also participate. And of course, my favorite topic is trade. You know, I grew up in trade. I live trade every day, and I will continue to live trade. I think we've got to get trade is the blood circulation in the world, and that is, you know, if you want to actually address this bifurcation issue, this issue of two-speed recovery that we're very, very concerned about, I think you've got to get the blood flowing to the right level. Got to get the trade flowing, and that would actually bring the economies and the companies and the SMEs in those economies into the world, and hence create now the integrated world that we all talked about. And I think I don't want to forget about the importance of policy, Marie, which I know you're addressing every day from a multilateral basis. But I think here with you outnumbered 3-1 on this panel, I think it's a clear indication that the business part, it's the bottoms up part that is also very important. And it has to be going on, you know, really simultaneously, or dare I say, even leading the recovery, leading the mending of and the creation of the new multilateral system. Okay, so that the policy can actually help cement it and perfect it. So I think that to me is the you know, what has really come through very clearly in this discussion. So before I close, I just want to give each of you the last word. We'll start with Sam, and then we'll go to Marie, and then we'll wrap up with Mark. How's that? And I think we need to close it just a few minutes. Just 1 minute each on your final thoughts. Sam?
Yeah, Victor, I think you said it extremely well, and so did everybody else on the panel. I think if you think about policy as strategy, right, but detailed executions operations, this is the world we live in. The private sector is very, very good at detailed plans to execute at scale. And the government's very good at policy and strategy. So we should accept our roles, right? Now we'd have to have agreement. Let's take climate change, right? And I guarantee you, we could all find the right people from all the different industries to get them together and lay out a 30-year plan on what you have to do investment-wise to make this energy system transition, right? And it's all elements of it, you know? I mean, it's not just shipping, cement, steel, it's electrification of cars. You can't plug them in. I mean, we can talk about this all we want, and Tesla could do 1 million cars of a 300 million unit industry or whatever the hell it happens to be, right, guys? You cannot plug them in, okay, right? So you got to go to all those detail levels, like a supply chain, Victor, your world that you know very, very well.
Yep.
So my proposal is, if we think about it, and I realize it's a big idea, and I don't want to shortchange it, but we have roles that we should be able to work together on. We ought to let the academics and the government establish strategy, policy, and then in that framework, allow the private sector globally to come together and lay out these details on the health system. Take the leading health institutions of the world. I happen to be from Hopkins, but lay them all out and do the same sort of thing. And I think we could make progress. But then you can't do it without investment, as Mark said. You have to have investment to get that done.
Thank you very much, Sam. Let me go quickly to you, Marie. You muted, Marie. Marie, yeah.
Sorry, yeah. I'm gonna say something about trade, because trade is also very much part of my being. And we met many years ago. We won't tell people how many years ago because of trade. And so for me, I totally agree with you. Trade has a big role in recovery. 3 concrete recommendations on that. Simple costless stimulus to reduce trade costs, simplify, streamline, trade facilitation kind of steps that will help the supply chain bottlenecks and will help economic recovery. Second, continue the economic integration in global markets, keeping markets open, our usual policy recommendation. Deepen and broader regional economic integration, including what's happening in Asia, RCEP, CPTPP, ASEAN-based integration, and most importantly, open and rules-based trading system under WTO, existing issues as well as new issues. And finally, global value chains need to be more agile and resilient. And the answer is diversification, not nearshoring or onshoring or this kind of more nationalistic processes that seem to be going on. And as we talked about many times, Victor, how do these supply chains become more agile using digital technology? And I think I would add also they also need to become part of the sustainable supply chain as well.
Absolutely, you're speaking my language, Marie. It's all about agility and resilience and also a sustainable way. Okay, Mark, last but not least, quick word from you. And we'll wrap up.
Much has been said. I think just going back, I think global partnerships are essential. Business and governments working together, competitors talking in a different way, the financial system supporting the operationalization of all of these issues, and governments making sure they send the right signal. You know, there is so much opportunity and so much ability to use technology in a very powerful and productive way. And I think we've got much to do, but I think it's in working in partnership that I think is most productive.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to just say on behalf of all of us around the world, we'd like to thank our panel. It's been a tremendous discussion, and I don't think I can add another word except thank you. See you soon.